Welcome to Destigmatizing Justice, the podcast where we tackle the tough conversations about conflict-related sexual violence against men. Brought to you by the Center for African Justice, Peace and Human Rights, we're here to break the silence, challenge the stigma, and champion the rights of all survivors. Join us as we explore expert insights and actionable steps towards justice and healing. Together, we can redefine justice because every voice matters.
Hello and welcome everyone. This is Sanjana, one of your hosts, and I'm here with Daniela and two guests that we have for this podcast. Maybe we can begin with you guys introducing yourselves.
Okay, my name is Glenn Miles. I've been working a lot of my adult life. I've been working in Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, but also South Asia as well. And I've been involved in child safeguarding and research regarding sexual abuse and exploitation of boys, young men, and transgender.
And my name is Jarrett Davis. I'm a researcher and consultant. Focuses largely on overlooked groups, so gap groups, which can be boys, young men, gender diverse youth. We do a lot of work with intersectionality. Glenn and I are both a part of the Up Collective, where we do a lot of our work with a network of partners around the world. But yes, we've been working together for like about 10, 15 years. The last 15 years, yeah, we've been together.
Now let's get right into it. We'd love to hear more about your organization and the research that you've been engaged in. Just a brief overview before we get into the more detailed parts of it.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Jarrett and I have been working with different NGOs over the time that we've been working together, but we've been involved in doing quite a bit of research. Just to give you a bit of a background on the research, I did my PhD on violence involving children in Cambodia. Now, Cambodia has a history of a genocidal regime, Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge, and that lasted for 3.5 years, but it had a devastating effect on the country. It was 3.5 years, but they're still experiencing the consequences of that now. I went into Cambodia in first of all in 1990, and then I went and I was working there from 1992, and then returned there in 2000. In the year 2000, I was with an organization called Tear Fund, which is a UK Christian development organization, and we did research with violence against children. That was my PhD research. So we looked at different forms of violence against children, including corporal punishment and all the way up to sexual violence. And one of the things that we found in it that was boys experience more violence than girls in every situation. So whether that was corporal punishment or sexual violence, they said that they had experienced more violence. And this was a study that was done over the whole country with representative children from every province in Cambodia. So quite an unusual project. And that was quite a surprise to all of us that it was so significant. And so after that, I was particularly concerned with looking at not just sexual abuse of boys and young men in schools, but also looking at out of school children, so street involved children. And then we moved into young men and boys who were involved in the sex industry. And so that became a really important area that we looked at. And I think because we were doing that, then we came across transgender who were also working in the same spaces. And so that's kind of an overview. We did other research as well, like looking at those who were involved in the abuse, so the perpetrators, looking at both foreigners and locals. But that was the scope of what we did, probably over a period from 2000 to 2012. That was what we focused on.
2012, then, when we started doing a lot of our work in massage parlors and street-based youth and things. One of the interesting things, building on some of Glenn's findings, 10 years prior, 10 or more years prior, is that we found that when we look at the experiences of boys and girls, when we're comparing them on the streets, so we've done this on the border between Cambodia and Thailand, in Phnom Penh, Manila, Bangkok, Chiang Mai, Sihanouk, with Kampong Som in southern Cambodia. And what we found was in every situation, now, well, obviously, we're looking at a subgroup, right? We're looking at children working on the streets. And when we're comparing gender, we're looking at that. This is specific to talk about children working on the streets. And we found in all of these studies, boys tended to be, in some cases, 4, and sometimes 7, and sometimes 3. It's always seen exponentially more reported experiences, at least, of sexual violence. And at first, there was some pushback on this. I think, well, where's this seems to go counter a lot of the narratives that we know. And what we find is that a lot of the narratives that we know are based on generalizations, are based on a lot of broad figures. But when you look on the streets at the actual experiences, if you're a family in poverty and you're forced to work on the streets, if you have 5 children, and you can only afford to take care of 3 of them, well, you let the boys run and do what they need to do, earn money, work. And the girls, they might still be working. Commonly believe that when girls experience sexual violence, they often will experience by people they know, where boys are more likely to experience it out by strangers, by other people. And this kind of really comes up when we're looking at these groups, we're looking at subgroups. And so the experiences are not the same, and oftentimes some of these broad terms that we use don't really take into account unique experiences of people. For instance, household surveys, school children surveys, which are kind of the bedrock of a lot of our understanding of this stuff, automatically overlook kids who don't go to school and kids who aren't in houses, which are some of the most vulnerable groups. And so it's very difficult, I think, to really understand the dynamics of some of these issues if we're not taking all of these different groups into account.
No, and then in addition to our work in Cambodia, we also did research in the Philippines and in Thailand, which hadn't had the experiences that Cambodia had, but there were still sufficiently high numbers of exploitation of boys and young men there as well. Interestingly, that even though these were quite different cultural areas, there were still serious problems. We also looked at the situation in Sri Lanka and in India. In Sri Lanka, they had the ongoing war situation there. And then also they had the problems with the tsunami. They had political infighting, so that was a problem. And then in addition to that, we had some work in researching with children or child militarized children from Myanmar who were in Thailand. So we've had some experience of some of the hotspots in the Asia region.
Thank you for that. I think you made some very valuable points there, including in the way that we do research from grassroots. As I understand that you have been looking at the problem, it uncovers some unexpected findings. As you also mentioned, a role of traditional gender roles in the way that different groups are susceptible to violence in different ways in different situations. I really like the fact that you mentioned examples in which conflict was a matter of the past, but still very present in the way that such underrepresented groups are still experiencing, but also examples of where conflict is still going on or other events such as natural disaster have a role to play. So thank you for starting the conversation with that. I would like to ask you, what do you think that these underrepresented groups could do, or what can I would say more institutions do to help these underrepresented groups of boys and men to be able to seek support when such cases of violence happen? So in terms of the institutional support that these groups can get, have you come across such type of support from institutions or perhaps from NGOs instead?
Yes. Okay. So, yeah, to be honest, there's actually very little in terms of support for children who've experienced violence, either in the areas where there's been war or genocide or disaster. It just is. Boys are often left to the side. I think because of the increased concern, particularly for girls who are seen to be very vulnerable, sometimes boys are a little bit left out. So whilst girls traditionally have been protected within the household, boys are often left to do their own thing, and that's not necessarily helpful. Boys also are often sent ahead in refugee situations so that they can look out for they can check out the land to see whether it's appropriate to bring the rest of their family into a country. And so in the situation that I worked in the refugee camps in Thailand on the Thai-Cambodian border, there was some emphasis, was some concern for girls and young women who were being trafficked from one into Thailand or into Vietnam. But in terms of young men and boys, very little is known or discussed about that. And we're very familiar with an organization in Thailand that are working with boys and young men, and they provide support to them, which is excellent. And that includes boys and young men who've been brought from Burma. I think there was quite a large percentage of the young men who they see are boys that have come from Myanmar or otherwise known as Burma, and they've done some very good support for them. But yeah, they're really an unusual organization. There's very few organizations that are actually doing much about boys at all.
There's been, and I think especially while there's like on the larger child protection front and addressing, there's been some movement, like you see the Global Boys Initiative that started with ECPAT International, and really didn't start with them. It started with really their grassroots partners that have been doing, responding to local needs a lot longer. But, so while there has been some movement, I mean, yeah, especially once you get to talk about conflict, the narrative usually goes towards, these are the number of women and girls that were affected. And these you hear it a lot, for instance, in like whether in blogs or radio programs, X number of people have died, of them so such percent was women and children. And what that's actually saying is that, or that have been affected or have experienced rape, majority of them women and children, or so many percentage are women and children. And oftentimes what they do is they're leaving out that 30 or 40% and just writing them off. And it's just very common because men become sort of the casualties of war. It's just sort of it's kind of it's what happens in war. So I guess, while there has been some movement on the child protection front, and there's been some change in language and the way that we understand gender now is really developed and all of that, which is great. We're challenging binaries and just those uncritical constructions, but still, we're fighting a lot more than just one simple narrative. We're coming against not only how parents and leaders, organizations view men and boys, what they've been sort of programmed to assume about them, this predator-prey narrative. But it's pushing against what parents might feel about children. Like, we can't have our kids growing up to, our boys growing up to rape, but we're not thinking about the other experiences, what they might experience, as well as how men and boys themselves are raised and packaged. What is their relationship with themselves, their own emotional lives? What does that look like? Are they able to connect with themselves, regulate themselves? And so there's all of these intersecting factors, from child rearing to the way that political leanings that. So when we talk about gender, just as when we talk about gender with women and girls, it bleeds into every aspect of life. So the same happens with men and boys. It just looks different, right? But yeah, so yeah, all of that to say, there's a whole lot that's been unexplored.
Yeah, I think that's also something that we come across in our work at the center quite often in the research that we are doing. There is very little coverage on sexual violence against men and boys. There are some shortcomings in that sense, because when we want to deliver a message to raise awareness of that, we always want to back up that information with research. So perhaps this research gap that we are talking about, so you mentioned on the societal level that it is to a certain extent about the attention that we give to this particular group, but also on a more research and academic perspective, there is not that much focus on it. So I wanted to ask you, what is your experience with that part of academic literature and this gap that is out there between the focus on violence against women and girls and between
Yes. One of the things that we've tried to do over the years is to speak in various international and regional and local conferences on the issue. Often when we do, the people who attend are the people who already get it. So, we'll be relegated to a small room where we present to people who already know what we're going to say and support us. Maybe you get one or two people on the fringes who are just interested, or maybe there's nothing else that they're that interested in, so they end up in your session. But where we need to be is in the plenary sessions, in the big sessions where we can say, please listen to what boys and young men have to say. And that's really disappointing, actually. So, we can have the best presentation, we can go to the largest, most impressive conferences, but if there's nobody really listening that's going to listen to us of significance, then we can't really do very much about it. I feel that that's very frustrating. I think that certainly within Cambodia, we have had an opportunity to talk to the Ministry of Social Affairs, to even to the Ministry of Women's Affairs, and so on. And so I feel like we've been able to have a bit of an influence there. But we need a bit more. We need a lot more people in our support network and who can make a noise. Otherwise, it's not really getting anywhere.
Yeah, well, and theoretically too, and I think to your point on the literature, things like that. I think that men and boys are often they're not, the issue of men and boys is not commonly understood or theorized as a feminist issue. It's seen as this other thing. You got women and girls, protect women and girls, and all this kind of stuff. But then we're not actually seeing the other side of the picture. And because they're boys, we're thinking that that's doesn't have anything to do with feminism. This has everything to do with feminism. This is about understanding that gender is something that we experience. It's something that it is something as an identity that's negotiated by the society that we're a part of, families that we're in, the friendships that we have. And yeah, so it's just we tend to have a very, very limited kind of understanding of what feminism is and what it means. And it means that we recognize this holistic nature, these aspects of everybody that we have, that we need to, programs and services, research, whatever it is, needs to respond to people as they are, as they present, as they in their own bodies, understanding that it's not always easy to live in your body, depending on what community you call safe, what community you were born into, right? So this goes a whole lot deeper than just
I think,
simple
for example,
gender binaries.
Research that was done in Cambodia by World Vision was described. The title of the research was "Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children," and we went to the opening of that. When we opened the book, the report that had been written, there was nothing about boys in it at all. So the problem is, if you say children generically, then people expect you to mean boys. If you say children and mean girls, then it just obfuscate, it just basically makes boys invisible, as if they don't exist. So that's really unhelpful. And we've often found, sometimes we're presenting it in conferences and contributing to various things, and we often there's this emphasis on, but girls have it much worse than boys. And then when you try to explain to them the actual level of violence that some boys experience when it comes to sexual violence, where their anus is torn, where they have injury to their penis, where they've been psychologically humiliated, then why do we need to compare? It's not something that needs to be compared. It's, they're both terrible things that happen
human
to
experiences
and girls, and we need to just talk about, in one sense, we need to talk about child exploitation and mean boys and girls.
I think something that kind of came up as you were saying that is another thing that I keep thinking of is this term, how the term, I'm not problematizing, but how this term is used, this term disproportionately affected. So we've had a lot of publications where we've been writing specifically on these issues about subgroups of people, men and boys, gender diverse individuals that are often systematically overlooked. And this has happened, a number of times to me as well as colleagues where they've had to, we're talking about a group that is, when you have a certain subsample that is 7 times or extraordinarily more likely to report being sexually abused, raped, working in very dangerous situations. And we usually don't use the word disproportionately because you don't want to use that because that's usually used for like women and girls. But oftentimes publishers will require us to put a caveat. But this disproportionately affects women and girls. It's like, okay, broadly speaking, yes, you're okay, right? But we're talking about a group, a subsample in a particular place who have specific experiences. And we find that sometimes that publishers are not often willing to publish if there's not certain language that sort of pass that litmus test. And we've had, not me specifically, but one of my colleagues have had articles where we're writing about articles that they've written, comparing it to men's rights movements, which is like the hard right, like that, which is like, it could not be more different than that, right? This is an inclusive kind of like, we're trying to understand people as humans who have experiences, and we're trying to, figure it out at a very root level. But oftentimes they will kind of dismiss it as like men's rights activism. It's like, well, that literally could not be farther from what we're really talking about here, So that in itself, the political nature of that within a lot of, maybe I say neoliberal, but kind of academic sources, gets really frustrating. It's very exhausting sometimes because they're just not able to move. When you see a person, a vulnerable person, you're like, okay, but what gender are you, right? What is this XXXY, because that matters, right? And I don't think it should matter so much. It's a human experience. Gender is all sorts of things.
Daniela, when we're thinking about children, I know that this podcast is really about boys in war zones in particular, and I think we have thought about that a bit. And I wanted to tell you about a project we've done with children from the Thai-Burmese border. So this was children who were militarized children. They were basically, what had happened was that they were in their villages, and then the soldiers from Myanmar had come into the village, and they had run away as instructed by their parents, just run away into the jungle to keep safe. And then when they come back into the village, all the adults, or most of them, have been annihilated and killed, and their villages destroyed. So when the resistance fighters come back into the village to find what's happened, they find these children, and basically these children are orphaned and they don't have anywhere to go. So then they take them back to their military camp, and then they kind of find tasks for them to do. I mean, in many ways they're a burden to them, but they find tasks for them. So some of the nimble boys, they'll train them to be snipers. Some of the strong boys and girls, they'll get them to carry the weapons and other things that they need as they're going through the jungle. Some of the children may be used to cook the food and so on, but others may be used for sex. These are men that are away from that home. They may be separated from their wives for long periods of time. And so that's a real risk. And I think one of the things, there was an organization that was based inside Thailand, and I can't give you much details about it, but they basically provided a safe house for these children on the request of a commander in one of the groups inside Myanmar, Burma. And so they provided them with a safe place to be. And then that was helpful for that particular group. And again, we don't normally recommend normally recommend it for children to be in residential care, it's better if they're community based. But if in this particular case there really wasn't another choice, so that was an appropriate thing. And we did a project with them where we got the children to draw before, during, and after. So they had 3 pieces of paper and they drew themselves before, themselves now, and themselves in the future. And so we wanted to get them to think about their possibility of their future and what they would like to do. And it was actually really encouraging to see these children, even though the situation was it felt very hopeless, that when we did that with them, they were very keen to consider opportunities they might have for the future. Another toolkit that we've developed is a toolkit called Welcome, and it's for children who have become refugees in a new country. Now, many of these children, we know that different refugee situations around the world have different reasons why children have to move and go to a new country. And we've translated this into a number of different languages now, but it's basically the story of 3 children from different refugee situations. One of them is a little boy, and he, on the transport to a foreign country that he uses, he's in the back of a truck, and then he's molested by a man. And so then that enables children to then talk about their feelings of what may have happened to them, and it validates their feelings. And we can certainly tell you how you can get hold of that Welcome toolkit if you think you can use that in your context. But I think it's really trying to be open to different ideas and listening to what children themselves want, because they are their children, they're the experts of their own experiences, so they know. And one of the things that we found very helpful in a refugee camp setting is to ask children the places that they feel unsafe. So, for example, one situation was where boys and girls were saying that they didn't like going to the public toilets, because in the public toilets they were more at risk of being touched, particularly at night. Somebody might sexually molest them, so they'd rather not do it. So one of the ideas that was suggested was to actually create really strong lighting around the public toilet and the washing area, so children could go to the toilet and wash without the fear of someone touching them behind in the shadows. And so that was a great suggestion. So these ideas, they come from the children themselves, and they understand. Another thing is in Sri Lanka, after the tsunami, and with all the stuff going on with the war still continuing, there's a concern that things like, suddenly there can be organizations coming in and saying, oh, we can arrange these children to be taken to a safe place, to a safe country, and they're involved in very hasty international adoptions. Now, that's totally inappropriate. Very often it hasn't even been established whether their parents are still there. Children in a war situation, children can be separated from their parents quite easily. If a war like happened in Cambodia, it happened all very quickly, and it went from the Khmer Rouge coming into the Phnom Penh and forcing people at gunpoint to leave. Well, at that point, people were in the markets and they were out and about doing different things, and then suddenly they're being forced to leave the city. Well, in a situation like that, people can get very separated very quickly. So when they do finally arrive into a refugee camp, for example, then it needs to be established whether they can find the parents, and organizations like the Red Cross do the necessary to find children, to try and help families to find each other. And that's really important. So, but certainly there needs to be safe spaces in refugee situations where children have been in displaced situations, so that children can feel safe. And those places can be really vital and important to keep children safe, whether they're girls or boys.
I actually wanted to ask you about, like you said, that children are the master of their own experiences, and that a lot of your research is centered around boys. And I wanted to ask you, because for our organization and also a lot of research, I noticed kind of assumes children to be agentless. How has that experience been for you in your research? And also, how do you approach gaining firsthand experiences and incorporating that into your toolkit? And then also, conversely, using the toolkit to talk to them as well? I was curious about that.
Yeah, that's very good. Jarrett, do you want to start and then?
Yeah, sure. It's really challenging, but I think being able to, I mean, especially with a lot of the different cultures, particularly in Southeast Asia, where we've done a lot of our work, there is kind of an vaulted assumption that parents are the owners of their children. There's a difference between owning and care, or being custodial caretakers of your children versus owning them, right? And so those are just, I mean, these aren't like any active, but it's just sort of like these background defaults that they ought to do this, they ought to. There's not a lot of consideration given. But, and for a lot of us that can remember childhood, we remember, we have full range of emotions. We have full range of experiences. We don't always understand everything and why things happen the way that they do. But we have our own thoughts and our ideas and passions and interests. And somehow when we switch positions and we become the adult in the situation, we tend to forget all of this depth and humanity that we have as children, right? And so, like, for for instance, one of the projects that I can really reflect on that was really helpful, like, is using using people that the kids know and are familiar with. So we work typically with social workers that are already invested within the communities. If they're not known personally, they don't have to be known personally. Depending on what we're talking about, they might be best that they're not, but at least they have a trusted. Usually, like working with street working children, there's certain logoed shirts that they might wear, whether it's a child safe logo or like a multiplying logo, different partners. The kids need to know that they're safe and that they're people who can speak their language, people who can really connect with them and understand their experience. But then the tools that we use, the tools that we develop are often very different. So for instance, on the online child sexual exploitation, that's a mapping project, that landscape mapping project. So did all sorts of multiple different frameworks that we used in Cambodia. And one of the things was to understand what experiences kids had online. Is we basically, with groups of kids in all these different provinces, we worked with local partners, and we just had giant pieces of construction paper and had kids work in groups. And then we had we had drawn out a world and this whole map of what the internet might look like. It's very, very vague, but they had to like kind of color in, like, okay, they filled out the rest of the map and said, okay, this is what my internet world looks like. These are the devices I connect with, and they kind of how I connect and where I connect. And so they're mapping it all out and coloring in stuff and having a good time. And then we asked them, well, look at so we all agree, each group, we all agree on our world that we've created, well, let's color in the different parts. Where are the safe places in this world? Right. So they might color in one color with a safe. Where are the dangerous places? We'll color that in. And then we can have a discussion about, well, what makes the safe places safe? Well, what makes this dangerous places dangerous? And we can have conversations. And through this, a lot of times kids directly start talking about dangerous experiences they've had. Adults who have asked for pictures of them, or adults who have shared nude pictures of themselves, all sorts of different risks and things. We don't have to actually define it and talk about sexual abuse and exploitation, especially but we kind of create a scenario where kids that are comfortable could be thinking about, okay, what makes me feel safe and what makes me feel unsafe? It's like sometimes kids really aren't really given the choice, especially if you're not really given autonomy over your own body. As a kid, like if you're kind of like, you're not really, so it's just, sometimes we don't really. So what makes me safe? What makes me feel this way? And then if there's not stuff that comes up there, then there's always room for discussions later as they need to be had. But doing these kind of creative things where we're all working together and we have fun, and then we eat a snack together, and that gets people in their bodies and comfortable so that they can see things. Very different than coming at people with a sheet of paper, right? So it's all about that kind of approach and how we can kind of create something that makes sense for kids so that they can be calm and in their bodies, so that they can access all of that stuff that they already have, that we often ignore that they have. That all their unique views and opinions and feelings and fears and things like that.
And it's helping children, boys in particular, to see that their feelings are valid so they're validated, whether if they need to cry about something, they can cry. If they need to know that you don't have to be strong just because you're a man, just because you're a boy. You can still be strong, but you can still be resilient in spite of the
Strength can
difficult things
involve
that come
tears.
to you.
You know?
So it's kind of they're reminded of that.
Yeah, exactly.
What has your role been in this as a male researcher, researching male problems and also trying to situate it within the field of feminism? And you said you had the leeway between publishers and language and how you present your findings and how you talk to people. And how has that experience been for you as researchers or activists or
Yeah, that's an interesting
Very
question. And it's interesting that we're being interviewed today by two women as well. This is very interesting, Daniela, and we're very grateful that you're taking the time to do this. But I know that it's a question that we ask when we're doing the research is, to children, would they prefer to be interviewed by a man or a woman? And if that's possible, then that's a good thing. I was trained as a nurse, and people would ask me if I was a male nurse because it was like this instinctive reaction to kind of clarify, oh, you're a male nurse, because usually it's women. So I'm used to that that misunderstanding about gender from way
Yeah.
back. It's like, are you a female doctor or are you a female lawyer? Or, there's an expectation that you should be one particular gender and you're not. One of the things we found in India was there was a woman social worker, and the boys, and it was mostly boys rather than young men. They preferred a motherly figure asking them difficult questions. And so it worked out really well, actually. And even though, the questions, there was obviously sexual questions as well, they felt comfortable enough to answer questions with that. I think it's very hard with boys because they don't, some of them have been abused by men and women. And so, then who do they feel safe with? And I think, actually spending time building a relationship with them through playing and talking to them and helping them to see that it's okay. It's okay. We're not going to harm you. We're here to help. And then also reminding them that they are helping us to help other children, because if other people understand the situation that boys are in, we might not be able to help them in particular, but we will hopefully be able to help other boys in the future. So that's often very motivating for children, actually, to know that they could be helping other children in the future.
Yeah.
Jarrett, what were you going to say?
Oh no, I was just gonna say, yeah, like I was just thinking, like, as approaching this as, being cis male, I think in this kind of field has I mean, it's in some ways it's a little bit, maybe I've just gotten used to it, but it is getting better. Like people are, I mean, just in my experience, I feel like people are having much more dynamic views of gender now, and realizing that regardless of where you come from, that you hold different spaces, right? You hold different identities. And I think in all of us doing this, we're not just Glenn and I, but others, around us that in our kind of network or group of people. And a lot of us have a lot of lived experience of being an outsiders looking in, and being, for various not just because of gender, but intersectional ways of being on the outside, being excluded, or being. So I think that being able to kind of own that and really feel that through is really important. For me, I think when I first started, there was a lot, especially being a white male. And I think that being, first of all, if you're worth your soul as a researcher, I feel like removing yourself from the picture is like one of the first skills, I think, especially if you're working cross culturally. You said that we try to put people on the ground, social workers, majority of social workers that we work with are women, but which is actually something we would like to see. We would like to see much more diversity in like local social workers. But so I remember this some instances even presenting where there have been. I remember one that was really funny. Someone that came up and had all these concerns about the research about me being male. Now I wasn't. really on doing the interviews. It was doing a lot of stuff on the back end and things like that. Had a lot of issues and said, how could you possibly doing this and this? And then as soon as I slipped into the conversation that I was gay, all of a sudden, all of their concerns all of a sudden disappeared. And so in the back of my mind, I'm kind of thinking, so when you had labeled me as one thing, all of these things were invalid. Now that you know that I'm a quote unquote minority group, it's like everything's changed. It's a very political. Yes, it is exactly. Yeah, I try to. I am a very talkative, hyperactive person sometimes, so it's a lot of just being very aware of yourself and what you kind of bring into a space, and just making sure that as much as possible you're removed from the picture.
That was another dimension that you just brought up, actually, because I didn't use the word white before, but most of your research is centered in Asia and now Africa, you say. How has that been? And also in terms of local grassroots organizations, how have they perceived that with you going in, focusing specifically on the white aspect of it as well?
Yeah.
Because you can also face animosity for that, I'm sure.
Sure. Absolutely. Like literally everything that we do is built on relationships, and
yes.
The approach starts with an individual who might have a need, and we just figure out how to make resources, making local connections as much as possible. I am white. A lot of my identity is really mixed and confused. I developed, I from 21, I was, really just lived I was in a seminary actually in Southeast Asia so a lot of my development has been third culture, I guess. And I think for a lot of us that are working in this group, we're like, obviously we carry plenty of stuff. Like we're Western people, but there's a lot of, I think we're centered on relationships.
We're trying to be, we would like to think ourselves as being post-colonial. We're not. We've got put through all of that, but of course, sometimes it doesn't work quite like that, and we brought up short. But we encourage people to remind us if they feel that we're dominating, and I think we make just the fact that we're putting a strong emphasis on listening to survivors is in itself post-colonial. So, we're saying you're valuable, you're important. As I say, you're experts of your own experience, and so in many ways that trumps anything that we think or say. And so I think that's how we do it. So as Jarrett says, it's all about relationships, really helping people to realize that they're valued. And I think, we're also aware that people often think that we're coming in with a lot of money. And honestly, Jarrett and I do a lot of what we do voluntarily. We're not paid. We've chosen not to work under the university system because we believe that often is very constricting in what we would be able to do. We're choosing to work with NGOs and listen to what they need and work with them. And we feel like we can get a lot more done that way as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we were just talking about as well. Like even in like a lot of the standard research expectations, if you're in academic communities, if you're in a lot of those traditional centers, they, for instance, won't provide funding if you're not willing to use randomized control trial, if you're doing a project or things like that, or, which a lot of times means that you're saying you get an intervention that is going to help your life, but you don't. This whole double-blind placebo thing, it gets really hairy and unethical when it's applied in other countries across these, in these kind of neo-colonial sort of like relationships that we have now between countries. It gets really ugly. We have plenty of other tools. We have like match case studies, and we have all sorts of different tools, a massive toolkit, but a lot of this, a neo-colonial world, we say, okay, this is the gold standard because it was developed by people in the US and is now being used, everywhere else. With AI tools now, we can do qualitative research at scale, where we're preserving nuance, local language, or local context. Obviously, there's still gaps that need to be filled, but we're in a new world now. Like we can play with these new tools. So for us, it's like we often have to find a lot of creative forms of funding, like creative, people that are invested, or organizations that are wanting to partner on something because they want it done in a certain way that's different from the kind of this more neo-colonial, post-colonial structure. But yeah. Anyway, that's where we're at.
I think that's a wonderful reflection to take on towards the end of the podcast episode. And thank you for the discussion on the positionality of the researcher and what it means to do research with the grassroots. I really think that's something to reflect on and to look into for the future. So I would like to ask you one final question. What would your advice be to researchers and practitioners who want to work in the field of sexual violence, and especially focused on men and boys in conflict zones?
Mhm. Well, let me tell you, I met Jarrett 12 years ago now. Was it Jarrett or more? I can't remember, something like that.
2011.
Yes. Anyway,
Yeah.
he asked me if he was asking me about whether I could suggest somewhere he could do his PhD. And I said, well, before you do that, why don't you come and work with me for a bit and see what it's like at the grassroots. And here he is now, and he hasn't
Here I still am.
he still hasn't
Love
got
it.
his PhD, but we're still working together. And I feel like we've
Still talking about it.
made an impact on the world. So I'm very pleased to continue to work with him. And I would just say, I do think that if you get into research and you really, you learn to understand it, and you can find someone who's got experience that you can work with, then you don't always need a PhD, to be honest. I know I shouldn't be saying that as somebody who's got a PhD, but I think that you can, I think there's some really good research that can be done. And I'm disappointed, I think, sometimes when when academics look at research that's being done by NGOs and call it grey literature as if it's not the same, not so valid. I mean, actually, they should be putting it above their research often, because they actually, they're really grounded in the
Talk to
content,
people on the ground.
and understand things better. So I would suggest that we just need to be willing to work in places that not everybody wants to work. And I think, war zones, whether that's a war zone or it's in a disaster situation or it's in, and if we can somehow combine the role of helping practical ways and doing research, I think that's the best way to do it, honestly. So
Yeah.
Jarrett, go on. You've got to say a bit now.
Yeah. I mean, I think honestly, lead with relationships, and I mean, I think starting with I think that's what's been I think the biggest thing for me is to kind of realize, in some ways, like I feel like I've been very fortunate because I haven't done the PhD work first. But so, like, all of my understanding of this is very much rooted in just practical experiences on the ground, doing qualitative research and class relationships between Class A and Class D Philippines, looking at how those domestic class structures are push forward the same exact relationship, the same feudal colonial relationships that were established previously by the Spanish, by the Americans, by the Japanese, by the, in the Philippines. But so my perspective has kind of really been from the grassroots looking up, and so now as we've been publishing and over these different years, I feel like it's only now, as time is going on, that I'm just like, that I really have, like, in some ways, even more deeply appreciated all of that experience, informal and messy as it has been. But thus is the nature of relationships, I guess, is you're working with really good partners on the ground who don't have a lot of resources and don't necessarily know how they're going to figure this out for this group of people that they know are suffering. And so just being able to work in that environment and leverage those, just work within those relationships and see how you can build something together. At first, I kind of thought that this was like I don't know. I think I've just, as time has gone on, I've really appreciated that kind of approach, and not realizing that I would appreciate it as much as what I have. Being willing to not break rules, but being willing to sort of question the structure itself, question the premise of what we're doing, and starting with people. I think that's what I would tell anybody. I think getting into this kind of work is that's where it's at. We learn those tools and methods and stuff like that. Those are tools. They serve us. We don't serve them, right? Those we are people are the core, and at the end of the day, that's what this is.
I think everything you said is really interesting, and also in my own personal identity as someone from India, I really appreciate your perspectives on working with grassroots organizations and local NGOs. I think we'd love to honestly hear more about your research when you start working on your project in Africa as well. And we'd love to also have you back and hear more about that in detail.
Sure. Yeah, we'd love to.
Yeah, we'd be happy to do that. Thank you. We feel very privileged to be invited. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into Destigmatizing Justice. We hope today's episode sparked your interest and inspired you to act. Please share it with others and join the conversation on our social media platforms. Let's keep dismantling stigma and building a world where justice is genderless. Until next time, remember that awareness is the first step towards change.